July 10, 1943. Fort Benning, Georgia. The sweltering summer heat pressed down on the parachute testing grounds as First Lieutenant William Davies watched another prototype fail catastrophically during the drop test. This was the seventh failure this month. As the dummy plummeted toward the earth, Davies knew that every failed test represented potential American lives lost in the coming invasion of Europe. Little did he know that the solution to their critical equipment problem would come not from the military's top engineers, but from a farmer from rural Alabama who understood fabric better than anyone at the Pentagon. "These men will be jumping into hostile territory with equipment that falls apart one time in 20, Major Peterson said beside him, wiping sweat from his brow. Unacceptable losses before they even hit the ground. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable story of how an overlooked farming technique, born from generations of necessity and ingenuity, would transform Allied airborne capabilities and save hundreds of lives during one of the most critical operations of World War II. The test field at Fort Benning had become a graveyard of failed prototypes. The fundamental problem was maddeningly simple, yet seemingly unsolvable. The standard-issue T-5 parachutes were failing under the increased weight requirements of the new combat equipment loads. When the airborne divisions were first conceived, each paratrooper was expected to carry approximately 35 pounds of equipment, but combat experience in North Africa and Sicily had proven that paratroopers needed significantly more ammunition, rations, and equipment to function effectively behind enemy lines. "We need them to carry at least 70 pounds now," Captain Howard Miller explained to the assembled team of engineers and textile specialists. "But when we reinforce the canopy with standard techniques, it becomes too rigid and tears along the seams instead of flexing with the opening shock." The engineering team from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology had tried various approaches. They had tested different materials, altered stitching patterns, and even attempted to create entirely new parachute designs. But the deadline for producing combat-ready parachutes for the planned European operations was approaching rapidly, and none of the proposed solutions had proven reliable enough for combat deployment. Major Peterson drummed his fingers on the conference table. "I want solutions, gentlemen, not excuses. We have thousands of men training for airborne operations right now, and I refuse to send them into combat with equipment that will get them killed before they even face the enemy." The room fell silent. The problem wasn't just a matter of engineering, it was a matter of life and death. In another part of Fort Benning, a very different scene was unfolding. The Quartermaster Corps had been expanded dramatically as the United States mobilized for war, and with so many men being drafted for combat roles, the Corps had begun hiring civilians for support positions. Among these new hires was 47-year-old Isaiah Washington, a cotton farmer from Macon County, Alabama, who had been recruited for his expertise in fabric and repair work. Washington had arrived at Fort Benning 3 months earlier. Despite his extensive knowledge of fabrics and stitching techniques gained from generations of cotton farming and the necessity of maintaining his own equipment and clothing, he had been assigned to the laundry facility. His supervisor, Sergeant Frank Miller, had been skeptical of Washington's abilities at first. "You say you know about fabrics?" Miller had asked during their first meeting, his tone making it clear he doubted the claim. "Yes, sir," Washington had replied quietly but confidently. "Been working with cotton since I was old enough to walk. My grandmother taught me to sew when I was 6 years old. Been making and mending ever since." Miller had assigned him to mending uniforms, expecting little, but within a week, the sergeant had been astonished by Washington's skill and efficiency. Washington could repair tears so seamlessly they were nearly invisible, and his reinforcement techniques for high-stress areas like knees and elbows outlasted standard repairs by months. "Where did you learn to stitch like this?" Miller had asked one day, examining a particularly impressive repair on a jacket that had been considered beyond salvaging. Washington's hands had continued working as he spoke. "My family's been farming cotton for generations, Sergeant. When you grow the cotton, process it, weave it, and wear it, you learn to understand the fabric, how it wants to move, where it wants to tear, how to work with its natural tendencies instead of fighting against them. By July, Washington had been promoted to head of the mending department, though his pay remained significantly lower than that of his white counterparts. He supervised a team of 6, including 2 other black civilians and 4 white women who had joined the war effort as part of the civilian workforce. On that fateful July afternoon, as the parachute test was failing on the testing grounds, Washington was working late, examining a batch of damaged parachutes that had been sent to his department. These weren't the primary canopies, but smaller reserve parachutes that had been damaged during training jumps. Most were slated for disposal, but with wartime rationing in effect, the Quartermaster Corps wanted to salvage any usable material. Washington spread one of the damaged parachutes across his large work table and studied the tear patterns with the careful eye of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding how fabrics behave under stress. "These ain't tearing the way they should," he murmured to himself. Alma Jenkins, one of the women on his team who was staying late to finish her quota, looked up from her sewing machine. "What do you mean, Mr. Washington?" Washington ran his fingers along the torn seam of the parachute. "Fabric wants to move. It's like water. It needs to flow. These seams are forcing it to break instead of bend." He pulled out a small notebook from his pocket, filled with diagrams and notes about stitching patterns he had developed over decades of working with fabrics. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for, a distinctive zigzag reinforcement pattern that his grandmother had taught him, originally developed by enslaved cotton workers before the Civil War. "See this?" He showed Jenkins the diagram. "This is what my grandmother called the river stitch. When the plantation owners would demand more cotton sacks than the material could reasonably hold, this stitching pattern would allow the fabric to stretch without breaking. Saved many from punishment when their sacks didn't split open in the fields." Jenkins leaned closer, intrigued. "And you think this could work for parachutes?" Washington nodded slowly. "It's not just the stitch itself. It's how you read the fabric, follow its natural lines of force. These military engineers, they're trying to make the fabric obey them. But you can't fight nature. You have to work with it." Over the next 3 hours, Washington carefully disassembled one of the damaged reserve parachutes and reconstructed it using his grandmother's techniques. The modifications weren't visually obvious. The changes were subtle, involving the direction of the stitching, the spacing between seams, and small reinforcement patterns at key stress points that allowed the fabric to flex and distribute force rather than concentrate it. When Sergeant Miller arrived the following morning, Washington was waiting for him with the reconstructed parachute. "What's this, Washington? I didn't authorize any full reconstructions." "I believe I found something that might help with those failing parachutes, sir. Been hearing about the problems from the riggers when they bring in damaged chutes." Miller looked skeptical, but took the parachute, examining Washington's work. "What's different about this? Looks standard to me." "It's not how it looks, sir. It's how it moves. The regular parachutes are tearing because they can't handle the extra weight. They're too rigid at the wrong points. I've used a technique from cotton farming that lets the fabric flex more naturally under stress." Miller sighed. "Washington, I appreciate your initiative, but the parachute problem has the best engineers in the country stumped. I doubt a—" He caught himself, but Washington knew what he had been about to say. "A colored farmer." "Just test it, sir," Washington said quietly. "What's there to lose?" More out of a desire to end the conversation than any real belief in the solution, Miller agreed to pass the reconstructed parachute along to the testing division. "Don't get your hopes up," he warned. "This is a complex engineering problem." Washington just nodded, but there was a quiet confidence in his eyes. He understood fabric in a way that engineers with all their calculations and theories never would. He understood it with his hands and with the inherited wisdom of generations who had worked with cotton under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Lieutenant Davies was preparing for another round of disappointing tests when Sergeant Miller approached him with Washington's reconstructed parachute. "One of my mending staff took it upon himself to try some folk technique on this reserve chute," Miller explained, his tone making it clear he didn't expect much. "I told him I'd pass it along, but I don't want to waste your time if you're busy." Davies, frustrated by weeks of failures, was willing to try anything. "We're testing prototypes all day, might as well add it to the lineup." The testing process was straightforward but rigorous. Each parachute design was packed according to standard procedures, then dropped with test dummies weighted to simulate fully equipped paratroopers. High-speed cameras recorded the deployment, and engineers measured the opening shock forces and descent rates. Washington's parachute was scheduled as the last test of the morning, almost as an afterthought. As the C-47 aircraft made its pass over the drop zone, the test crew released the dummy with the reconstructed parachute. Davies watched through binoculars, expecting yet another failure to add to their growing list. The parachute deployed cleanly. Even from the ground, Davies could see something different about how the canopy inflated. It seemed to expand more progressively, the fabric rippling in a controlled wave rather than snapping open all at once. The dummy, weighted with 85 pounds of simulated combat equipment, 15 pounds more than their target weight, descended smoothly to the ground. "Get me the readings on that last drop," Davies called to the monitoring team. The numbers were remarkable. The opening shock force was 37% lower than their best prototype while maintaining the same descent rate. The stress sensors on the canopy showed more evenly distributed forces, with no single point experiencing the critical stress that had caused previous failures. "Whose design is this?" Davies asked, suddenly intensely interested. "It's not really a design, sir," Miller explained uncomfortably. "One of my civilian staff in the mending department modified it, a colored fellow named Washington." Davies looked at him sharply. "I don't care if he's purple with green spots. This is the first promising result we've had in weeks. I want to meet him immediately." The meeting between Lieutenant Davies and Isaiah Washington took place that afternoon in a small conference room in the quartermaster building. Davies had brought Captain Rosenthal, their chief engineer, and Major Peterson had insisted on attending once he heard about the successful test. Washington sat stiffly in his chair, cap in hands, eyes downcast as military protocol dictated for civilian employees, especially black employees, when addressing officers. But when Davies asked him to explain what he had done to the parachute, Washington's demeanor changed subtly. Though still respectful, there was a quiet authority in his voice as he spoke about fabric in a way none of them had ever heard before. "The problem isn't the strength of the material, sir. It's how the force moves through it. Military stitching is like a dam. It stops the force in one place, makes it build up until it breaks through. My grandmother taught me to make stitches like a river system, channeling the force along natural pathways, dividing it into smaller streams that the fabric can handle." He placed his notebook on the table and opened it to show his diagrams. The officers leaned forward, suddenly seeing not a middle-aged black farmer, but a textile expert with unique insights. "This pattern here," Washington continued, pointing to a zigzag reinforcement design, "we used it for cotton sacks that had to hold more weight than they were made for. It lets the fabric breathe and flex. And this spacing method," he turned the page to show another diagram, "it's based on how cotton plants grow. Nature already figured out the strongest way to distribute force." Captain Rosenthal studied the diagrams with growing excitement. "The mathematical principles are sound," he said almost to himself. "It's distributing the opening shock force logarithmically rather than linearly. Why didn't we think of this?" Washington looked at him steadily. "With respect, sir, you can't learn fabric from books alone. You have to feel it, work with it every day, understand its nature. My family's been doing that for generations out of necessity." Major Peterson, initially skeptical, was now fully engaged. "Can these modifications be implemented in our current production process?" "We don't have time to redesign everything from scratch," Washington nodded. "Yes, sir, the changes are mainly in the stitching patterns and reinforcement placements. The basic design stays the same. Your existing equipment and materials would work fine." Davies made a decision. "I want 3 more test prototypes with Washington's modifications by tomorrow. If they perform consistently, we'll run a full testing series." Over the next week, Washington worked alongside the engineering team, showing them his techniques and explaining the principles behind them. There was initial resistance. Some of the white engineers were uncomfortable taking direction from a black farmer with no formal education. But as test after test proved successful, professional respect began to overcome personal prejudice. Rosenthal, in particular, became Washington's strongest advocate. The Jewish engineer from Brooklyn recognized another outsider, with valuable skills being marginalized by the system. He meticulously documented Washington's techniques, translating them into the technical language required for military specifications while ensuring Washington received proper credit for the innovation. "These stitching patterns are remarkable," Rosenthal told Washington as they worked late one evening. "They're intuitive yet mathematically perfect for force distribution. Where exactly did they originate?" Washington's hands moved steadily, showing Rosenthal how to properly align the reinforcement strips. "My grandmother learned them from her mother, who learned them before the war, the Civil War, that is. Cotton sacks had to hold more and more weight as demands increased. If your sack split open in the field—" He didn't finish the sentence, he didn't need to. Rosenthal nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken history. "So these techniques were developed under the most extreme pressure, quite literally. Necessity makes for good teachers," Washington replied simply. By the end of July, the modified parachute design had undergone 23 successful tests with 0 failures. The highest test weight had been 110 pounds, far exceeding the requirements for combat operations. Major Peterson called a meeting with the full development team and several senior officers from Airborne Command. "Gentlemen, I believe we have our solution," Peterson announced, gesturing to the performance charts displayed on the wall. "The Washington modified T-5 parachute has outperformed every other prototype by a significant margin." Colonel Harris, who had flown in from Washington, D.C. specifically for this meeting, studied the results with a critical eye. "These numbers are impressive, but can we implement these changes quickly enough? The 82nd and 101st Airborne are scheduled for deployment to England in less than 2 months. Peterson nodded to Captain Rosenthal, who stood and addressed the question. "We've already developed modified production specifications, sir. The changes require additional stitching time, but no new materials or equipment. Our analysis shows we can retrofit existing parachutes at a rate of 500 per week per facility and modify production lines for new chutes within 10 days. "And you're confident in the reliability?" Harris pressed. "100%, sir," Davies interjected. "We've done drop tests under every conceivable condition: high winds, excessive weights, deliberate partial failures to simulate damage. The Washington modifications improve performance across all parameters. These are the most reliable parachutes we've ever tested." Harris turned his attention to Washington, who was seated quietly at the far end of the table, present for the technical discussions but careful to remain unobtrusive. "Mr. Washington," Harris addressed him directly, causing several officers to shift uncomfortably at the unusual respect being shown to a black civilian. "Captain Rosenthal tells me these techniques have been in your family for generations." "Yes, sir," Washington replied, "passed down from the days when my ancestors picked cotton as slaves." A heavy silence fell over the room at the direct reference to slavery, a subject generally considered impolite to mention in mixed company, especially in Georgia in 1943. Harris held Washington's gaze for a long moment. "It appears, Mr. Washington, that your family has provided a service to this country that may save hundreds, perhaps thousands of American lives. I'd like to formally recommend that your techniques be adopted as the new standard for all airborne parachute systems, with full acknowledgement of your contribution." The proposal to officially name the modification after Washington met with resistance from several quarters. Despite the undeniable success of the design, there were those in the military hierarchy who objected to having equipment named after a black civilian. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The official designation would be T5 Modified, Pattern B, but all the technical documentation would credit the Washington reinforcement technique in the specifications. For Washington himself, the recognition was less important than seeing his grandmother's wisdom put to use saving lives. When offered a position as a technical consultant with significantly higher pay, he accepted primarily because it would allow him to send more money home to his family in Alabama. By August, production of the modified parachutes was in full swing at facilities across the country. Women working in parachute factories from New York to California learned the specialized stitching patterns that Washington's family had developed over generations. Many were told simply that they were implementing a new, improved technique developed by military engineers. But at some facilities, particularly those in the north with integrated workforces, the true story began to spread. At the Pioneer Parachute Company in Manchester, Connecticut, Supervisor Eleanor Thomas gathered her production team to explain the new specifications. "Ladies, these new stitching patterns may seem unusual, but they're based on techniques developed by cotton workers in the South," she explained, carefully avoiding the word slaves while ensuring the women understood the significance of what they were implementing. These patterns allow the fabric to flex and distribute force more effectively than our standard techniques. Each parachute you complete with these modifications could mean the difference between life and death for our boys overseas. Doris Miller, whose brother was serving with the 101st Airborne, stayed after the briefing to examine the pattern diagrams more closely. "Who figured out that these old techniques would work for parachutes?" she asked. Thomas hesitated, then decided that the truth served the war effort better than evasion. "A farmer named Isaiah Washington from Alabama. He's been working with the development team at Fort Benning." "A colored farmer figured out what all those engineers couldn't?" Doris asked, surprised. "That's right," Thomas replied. "Turns out generations of experience with cotton created expertise our engineering schools never thought to study." The women of Pioneer Parachute took particular pride in mastering the complex Washington patterns. Production was slower at first as they learned the new techniques, but within weeks they were producing parachutes that they knew with certainty would perform better than any others in the field. Each woman initialed the inspection tag on her completed parachute, a personal guarantee of quality and a connection to the airborne trooper who would ultimately stake his life on her workmanship. Meanwhile, at Fort Benning, Washington continued working with the engineering team to refine the design further. His status had changed dramatically. Officers now consulted him directly on technical matters, and his expertise was sought on other equipment issues involving textiles. While he still faced discrimination in many aspects of daily life, within the confines of the parachute development facility, he was respected as an authority. In September, with the modified parachutes now in full production, Washington was invited to observe a training jump by a company from the 82nd Airborne. As the C-47 aircraft roared overhead and paratroopers began to leap into the sky, their canopies blossoming above them like giant flowers, he felt a surge of emotion that caught him by surprise. Captain Rosenthal, standing beside him, noticed his expression. "Something wrong, Isaiah?" Washington shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the descending paratroopers. "My grandmother would never have imagined this," he said quietly. Her stitching patterns, designed to prevent punishment under the overseer's whip, now saving the lives of American soldiers fighting for freedom on the other side of the world. Rosenthal placed a hand briefly on Washington's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that would have been unthinkable a few months earlier. "History takes strange paths," he said, "but I believe your grandmother would be proud to know that the knowledge she preserved is now serving a greater purpose." As the paratroopers landed safely on the drop zone, Washington thought about the cotton fields of Alabama where he had grown up, the countless hours spent learning fabric and stitching from his parents and grandparents. Knowledge born from oppression was now being transformed into a tool for liberation, a powerful testament to the resilience and ingenuity of his family and community across generations. Lieutenant Davies approached them as the last paratrooper landed. "Not a single malfunction," he reported with satisfaction. "The men are saying these new chutes open smoother than anything they've jumped before. Less opening shock means fewer injuries, better control on descent." "What are they calling them?" Rosenthal asked. Davies grinned. "Officially, they're T5 modified, Pattern B. Unofficially, the riggers have started calling them Isaiah chutes. Word gets around." Washington looked startled. "They know about me?" "The riggers do," Davies confirmed. "They're the ones who pack the chutes and inspect them between jumps. They can see the difference in the stitching patterns. One of them has a cousin working at Pioneer Parachute who told him the whole story." As they walked back toward the base, a young paratrooper approached them, still partially harnessed in his jump gear. He saluted the officers, then turned to Washington. "Are you Mr. Washington, sir?" he asked. Washington nodded, uncomfortable with being addressed as sir by a white soldier. The paratrooper extended his hand. Private James Cooper, sir. Just wanted to shake your hand. The riggers told us about the new chutes, how they came from techniques your family developed. That was the smoothest opening I've ever felt. Thought I was going to get the wind knocked out of me like usual, but it was like floating on a cloud. Hesitantly, Washington shook the offered hand. Just doing my part for the war effort, Private. Well, sir, when I jump into Europe, shall I be thinking of you and your grandmother? Might just say a little thank you prayer on the way down. As Cooper rejoined his unit, Washington stood a little straighter. In that moment, something shifted in his perception of his contribution. This wasn't just about technical specifications and force distribution diagrams. It was about young men like Cooper, who would be jumping into hostile territory, trusting their lives to fabric and stitching patterns that connected them directly to Washington's family heritage. By October, thousands of the modified parachutes had been shipped to airborne units, training in England for the eventual invasion of Europe. Although Washington's direct involvement with the project was coming to an end, his impact would soon extend far beyond what anyone at Fort Benning could have predicted. Colonel Harris returned to Fort Benning for a final inspection before the official adoption of the modified design across all airborne divisions. After reviewing the production reports and the overwhelmingly positive feedback from training units, he requested a private meeting with Washington. "Mr. Washington," Harris began once they were seated in his temporary office, "I wanted to personally thank you for your contribution to our airborne forces. The reports from England indicate that training jump injuries have decreased by over 40% since the introduction of your modified parachutes." "Thank you, sir," Washington replied. "I'm glad they're performing well." Harris studied him for a moment, then continued, "I understand that you'll be returning to your farm in Alabama now that the development phase is complete." Washington nodded. "Yes, sir. The cotton needs harvesting, and my family needs my help." "What if I told you that your country needs your help even more?" Harris leaned forward. "The War Department is establishing a new technical advisory unit for textile-based equipment. We need people with your expertise to continue improving not just parachutes but tents, uniform reinforcements, equipment harnesses, anything where fabric performance affects operational capability." Washington looked surprised. "You're offering me a job, sir." "I'm offering you a position as a civilian technical consultant to the Quartermaster Corps, with appropriate compensation and the authority to implement your techniques across multiple equipment categories." Harris paused. "It would mean relocating to Philadelphia, where our main development facility is located." For Washington, the offer represented both opportunity and dilemma. Philadelphia meant better schools for his children, better pay, and escape from the most oppressive aspects of life in the segregated South. But it also meant leaving behind the land his family had worked for generations, the community that had supported them, and the farming life that, despite its hardships, was deeply ingrained in his identity. "I'll need to discuss it with my family, sir," he said finally. Harris nodded. "Of course, but I want you to know that this isn't charity or politics, Mr. Washington. This is about winning the war with the best equipment possible. Your knowledge is valuable to the United States Army, and we're prepared to recognize that value appropriately." As Washington left the meeting, he found Captain Rosenthal waiting outside. "He offered you the Philadelphia position?" Rosenthal asked. Washington nodded. "How did you know?" "Because I recommended it," Rosenthal admitted. "Isaiah, what you know, what your family has preserved, it's too valuable to go back to being used just on a single farm in Alabama. Men like us, we have knowledge that the establishment doesn't teach in their fancy schools. But that doesn't make it any less valuable or valid." Washington considered this. "My family's been on that land since just after the Civil War," he said quietly. "First as sharecroppers, then we managed to buy it during Reconstruction. Leaving isn't simple." "I understand," Rosenthal replied. "My parents left everything behind in Poland to come to America. It wasn't easy. But they did it so their children would have better opportunities." He paused. "Think about what this could mean for your children, Isaiah." That evening, Washington sat alone in his quarters, writing a letter to his wife, Martha. He explained Colonel Harris's offer in detail, laying out both the opportunities and the challenges it presented. He wrote about the young paratroopers who would be jumping into combat with parachutes incorporating his grandmother's wisdom, and about the possibility of their own children attending better schools in the North. As he sealed the envelope, Washington thought about the strange journey that had brought him from the cotton fields of Macon County to Fort Benning, and potentially now to Philadelphia. His grandmother had taught him stitching patterns developed under slavery to help survive an oppressive system. Now those same patterns would help American soldiers survive as they fought against fascism and oppression in Europe. There was a profound irony in this transformation that wasn't lost on Washington. The techniques born from one of America's greatest moral failures were now helping to preserve its highest ideals on foreign battlefields. History, as Rosenthal had observed, indeed took strange paths. The next morning, Washington mailed his letter and returned to work on what might be his final project at Fort Benning, a comprehensive documentation of the cotton farming textile techniques that had been preserved in his family for generations. As he carefully diagrammed each pattern and explained its purpose and application, he realized he was creating something unprecedented, a formal record of knowledge that had previously existed only in the hands and memories of people like his grandmother, people whose expertise had been systematically devalued and ignored. "This is more than just parachute specifications," Rosenthal observed as they worked. "This is preserving a unique American technical tradition that nearly disappeared." Washington looked up from his diagrams. "My grandmother would say that knowledge belongs to those who need it," he replied. "Right now, those paratroopers need it more than anyone." December 18th, 1943, Cottingham, England. Snow fell softly outside the converted factory building, where members of the 82nd Airborne Division prepared their equipment for an upcoming training exercise. Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan carefully inspected the parachutes assigned to his stick, paying particular attention to the distinctive stitching patterns that had become known throughout the airborne units as Isaiah patterns. As he ran his fingers along the reinforced seams, Donovan thought about the black farmer in Georgia, whose techniques had transformed their most essential piece of equipment. None of the men in his unit had ever met Isaiah Washington, yet many of them spoke of him with a familiarity born of trusting their lives to his expertise every time they jumped. "These reinforcements are holding up better than anything I've ever seen," Sergeant Donovan told the newly arrived replacement rigger, Private Thomas Keller. 3 months of heavy training jumps, and we haven't had a single critical failure. Before these modifications, we were losing at least 1 shoot in 20 to stress tears." The young private examined the stitching pattern with curiosity. "I heard these came from some special technique used by cotton farmers. That true?" "Not just any cotton farmers," Donovan replied. "This specific pattern was developed by slaves before the Civil War. The story going around is that a colored farmer named Washington showed the engineers at Fort Benning how his grandmother used to reinforce cotton sacks when they had to carry more weight than they were designed for." Private Keller looked skeptical. "And the Army actually used his ideas just like that?" Donovan laughed. "Hell no, not just like that. From what I heard, they tried everything else first. But when Washington's prototype outperformed everything their engineers had come up with, they had to admit he was onto something. War has a way of making people practical about where good ideas come from." As the paratroopers prepared for what would be their final major training exercise before the invasion of Europe, similar conversations were happening across England wherever airborne units were stationed. The modified T-5 parachutes had acquired a reputation that bordered on the mythical. Jumpers reported smoother openings, less opening shock, and greater stability during descent. Riggers marveled at how the canopies maintained their integrity even after dozens of jumps. And throughout it all, the story of Isaiah Washington and his grandmother's stitching patterns continued to spread, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Washington had made his decision. After lengthy discussions with his wife and children, he had accepted Colonel Harris's offer to join the Technical Advisory Unit in Philadelphia. The transition had not been easy. Leaving the farm in the care of his brother-in-law and moving his family north had been a momentous change. But as 1943 drew to a close, Washington found himself working in a large facility where his expertise was valued and his contributions recognized in ways that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. In Philadelphia, Washington worked with a team of engineers and textile specialists, applying his family's techniques to a wide range of military equipment. His initial focus remained on parachute systems, but he gradually expanded his work to include equipment harnesses, tent reinforcements, and specialized gear for mountain troops. Throughout it all, he maintained a correspondence with Captain Rosenthal, who had been deployed to England to oversee the implementation of the modified parachutes, with the airborne divisions preparing for the invasion. "Your parachutes are performing beyond all expectations," Rosenthal wrote in January 1944. "The men have complete confidence in them, which is perhaps the highest praise military equipment can receive. Some have even started calling them grandma's chutes, after hearing the story of how your grandmother taught you the techniques. I hope that doesn't offend you. It's meant with genuine respect." Washington was not offended. In fact, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that his grandmother's wisdom, born from hardship and necessity, was now being recognized and valued. He often thought about what she would make of this unexpected turn of events, her careful lessons in fabric and stitching, taught in the quiet evenings after long days in the cotton fields, now saving the lives of soldiers halfway around the world. As the winter of 1943 gave way to the spring of 1944, preparations for the invasion of Europe entered their final phase. In England, the airborne divisions conducted increasingly complex training jumps, often carrying their full combat loads and performing tactical exercises immediately upon landing. The reliability of the modified parachutes became even more apparent as the physical demands on the equipment increased. Colonel James Matthews, commander of a battalion in the 101st Airborne, wrote a commendation after a particularly demanding night training jump in challenging weather conditions. "The performance of the T-5 modified Pattern B parachutes during last night's exercise was exemplary," he stated in his official report. "Despite gusting winds exceeding 20 miles per hour and full combat equipment loads, all 216 jumpers landed safely with no equipment malfunctions. The improved canopy stability provided jumpers with greater control during descent, resulting in more accurate landings and fewer landing injuries. It is my professional assessment that these modified parachutes represent a significant tactical advantage for our airborne forces." Such reports found their way back to Washington in Philadelphia, where they were received with quiet pride. Yet even as his work gained recognition within military circles, Washington remained largely unknown to the general public. The contributions of Black Americans to the war effort were seldom highlighted in newspapers or newsreels, and the technical nature of Washington's innovation made it less visible than combat achievements. This began to change, however, when Eleanor Roosevelt visited the Philadelphia facility as part of her ongoing efforts to promote racial integration in the war industries. During her tour, she was shown various equipment improvements developed by the Technical Advisory Unit, including the modified parachute design. "And who developed this stitching pattern?" she asked, examining the distinctive reinforcement technique. "That would be Mr. Washington, ma'am," replied the facility director, gesturing to where Washington stood respectfully at the back of the group. Mrs. Roosevelt immediately walked over to him. "Mr. Washington, I understand your design has made quite an impact on our airborne capabilities. Would you tell me more about it?" For the next 15 minutes, the First Lady listened intently as Washington explained how the techniques had been passed down through generations in his family, originating with enslaved ancestors who had developed specialized skills working with cotton. "This is precisely the kind of contribution that demonstrates why integration and equal opportunity are not just moral imperatives, but practical necessities for our nation," Mrs. Roosevelt said afterward to the assembled staff. "Talent and expertise exist in all communities, and we cannot afford to overlook them, especially in wartime." Following Mrs. Roosevelt's visit, a brief article appeared in several black newspapers, including the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, highlighting Washington's contribution to the war effort. For many black Americans working in war industries or serving in segregated military units, the story provided a source of pride and validation, evidence that their communities were making significant, even if often unacknowledged, contributions to the Allied cause. By May 1944, as the final preparations for the invasion of Normandy were underway, the modified parachutes had become standard issue for all American airborne units. Thousands of paratroopers would soon stake their lives on equipment incorporating the Washington reinforcement techniques, though most would never know the full story behind the innovations that increased their chances of survival. On the evening of June 5, 1944, Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan stood in line with his stick of paratroopers, waiting to board the C-47 that would carry them to Normandy. The men were weighed down with more equipment than they had ever carried before: weapons, ammunition, rations, demolition charges, medical supplies, and specialized gear for their particular missions. Many had discarded personal items to make room for extra ammunition and equipment, knowing they would be fighting without resupply for an indeterminate period after landing. As Donovan performed a final check of his main and reserve parachutes, he thought again about the farmer in Georgia, whose techniques were now integrated into the equipment that would deliver them safely to the battlefield. He had never been particularly religious, but as he touched the reinforced seams of his parachute, he found himself offering a silent prayer of thanks to Washington and his grandmother for the knowledge they had preserved and shared. "Mount up," came the order, and Donovan led his men toward the waiting aircraft, each step bringing them closer to the moment when they would leap into the darkness over occupied France, trusting their lives to skill, training, and the integrity of their equipment. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Isaiah Washington worked late into the night, finalizing specifications for a new equipment harness designed to better distribute the weight of the heavy loads paratroopers now routinely carried. He had received word that the invasion was imminent, though the exact date and location remained closely guarded secrets. As he worked, he thought about the young men who would soon be jumping into combat, with parachutes incorporating his family's techniques. "Be with them," he whispered, a prayer for people he had never met, but with whom he now shared a profound connection. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the sky over Normandy filled with aircraft. Despite careful planning, the airborne drop was chaotic. Anti-aircraft fire, unexpected cloud banks, and pilot inexperience resulted in paratroopers being scattered widely across the Norman countryside, often miles from their intended drop zones. Many units found themselves broken into small groups, surrounded by enemy forces, and cut off from their command structure. Yet amid this chaos, something remarkable happened. The modified parachutes performed exceptionally well under combat conditions. Paratroopers, carrying even heavier loads than anticipated, descended through artillery barrages and machine gun fire with canopies that withstood the stress. Even when damaged by enemy fire, the reinforced stitching patterns prevented catastrophic failures, allowing wounded canopies to maintain enough integrity to deliver their human cargo safely to the ground. Private First Class James Cooper, the young paratrooper who had shaken Washington's hand at Fort Benning, landed in a flooded field several miles from his intended drop zone. His heavily loaded parachute had been grazed by machine gun fire during descent, tearing a foot-long gash in the canopy. Yet the reinforced stitching had prevented the tear from spreading, allowing him to land safely despite the damage. Cooper quickly met up with several other scattered paratroopers from different units. As they organized themselves into an impromptu fighting group, he noticed that every one of them had landed safely, despite the hazardous conditions. In that moment, he remembered his brief encounter with Washington and the promise he had made to say a thank you prayer on the way down. With enemy forces nearby and an uncertain situation ahead, Cooper took a moment to silently fulfill that promise before moving out with his newfound companions. Across the Norman countryside, similar scenes played out as paratroopers regrouped and began carrying out their missions despite the scattered drop. The reliability of their parachutes had ensured that more men reached the ground safely than military planners had dared to hope, given the challenging conditions. This higher-than-expected survival rate would prove crucial in the coming days, as the scattered airborne forces disrupted German defenses and secured key objectives in support of the beach landings. The true impact of Washington's modifications became apparent in the after-action reports compiled in the weeks following the invasion. Colonel Wallace Hampton, tasked with analyzing airborne equipment performance during the operation, noted a significant discrepancy between projected and actual casualty rates during the initial drop. Based on historical data and the challenging conditions encountered, we projected a parachute malfunction rate of 6 to 8%, Hampton wrote. Actual malfunction rate was less than 1%, despite numerous canopies sustaining damage from enemy fire. The Washington reinforcement technique proved particularly effective in preventing the propagation of battle damage, with multiple documented cases of canopies maintaining sufficient integrity for safe descent despite significant tears. Hampton's report included testimony from riggers who had examined recovered parachutes after the jump. Technical Sergeant William Murphy, a veteran rigger with the 82nd Airborne, provided a particularly detailed analysis. "I've examined over 50 recovered canopies, and the performance of the reinforcement stitching is remarkable," Murphy stated. "In at least a dozen cases, I observed damage that would have led to catastrophic failure with our previous designs. The way the Washington pattern distributes stress away from damaged areas allowed these canopies to maintain structural integrity despite significant trauma. Based on my technical assessment, I estimate that the modification saved at least 100 lives during the Normandy drop among the 82nd Airborne alone." Similar reports from the 101st Airborne and other units supported Murphy's assessment. Altogether, the data suggested that the modified parachutes had saved approximately 500 paratroopers who would likely have perished due to equipment failure under the previous design. This information reached Washington in late July 1944, delivered personally by Captain Rosenthal, who had returned to the United States to oversee production of specialized equipment for upcoming operations in the Pacific Theater. "The brass wanted me to tell you this in person," Rosenthal explained, handing Washington a folder containing copies of the relevant reports. "Colonel Hampton estimates that your modifications saved approximately 500 lives during the Normandy drop. That's 500 men who made it to the ground safely because of stitching patterns your grandmother taught you." Washington accepted the folder with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the impact his contribution had made. 500, he repeated softly. "That's just the beginning," Rosenthal continued. "Those 500 men went on to secure bridges, capture strategic crossroads, and disrupt enemy reinforcements. Military analysts believe their actions saved thousands more lives among the forces landing on the beaches, and now we're implementing your techniques in equipment for the Pacific Theater as well." Washington sat in silence for several minutes processing the information. Finally, he looked up at Rosenthal. "My grandmother used to say that knowledge carries responsibility," he said quietly. "That when you know how to do something well, you have a duty to use that knowledge to help others. I don't think she ever imagined her lessons would reach so far." "She would be proud," Rosenthal replied, "and so should you be." In the months that followed, as Allied forces pushed across France and toward Germany, Washington continued his work with the Technical Advisory Unit, expanding the application of his techniques to new equipment challenges. The success of the modified parachutes had earned him increased authority and resources, and he assembled a small team of specialists who worked under his direction. In October 1944, Washington received a letter from Private First Class Cooper, who had survived the Normandy campaign and was now preparing for Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands. "Dear Mr. Washington," the letter began, "you may not remember me, but I met you briefly at Fort Benning last year. I told you I'd say a prayer of thanks when I jumped into combat. And I want you to know I kept that promise during the Normandy drop. My chute took some machine gun fire on the way down, but it held together just like you designed it to. There were 6 of us in my stick whose chutes were damaged, but held together anyway. We all made it down safely and went on to hold a critical bridge for 36 hours against repeated attacks. We've been issued new equipment for our next operation, and I was relieved to see that the parachutes still have your reinforcement patterns. The riggers say they're even better than the ones we used in Normandy. Just wanted you to know that your work is making a real difference over here. The men in my unit have heard the story about you and your grandmother, and they all send their thanks." The letter was signed, "Gratefully yours, PFC James Cooper, 101st Airborne Division." Washington shared the letter with his wife, Martha, who had initially been hesitant about the move to Philadelphia, but had come to appreciate the opportunities it provided for their children. Their oldest son, Isaiah Jr., was now attending a desegregated school and excelling in mathematics and science, educational opportunities that would have been impossible in rural Alabama. 500 families still have their sons, brothers, and husbands because of what your grandmother taught you, Martha said after reading Cooper's letter. That's a powerful legacy, Isaiah. Washington nodded. I've been thinking about that legacy, about how to make sure this knowledge isn't lost again. What do you mean? The Army is interested in the results, but not necessarily in understanding the principles behind them, Washington explained. Once the war ends, they might file away these techniques without really preserving the deeper knowledge. I want to document everything properly, not just the patterns themselves, but the thinking behind them, how to read fabric, how to work with its natural tendencies instead of against them. Knowledge that's been in our community for generations, but has never been properly recorded or respected. In November 1944, Washington presented a proposal to Colonel Harris for a comprehensive documentation project. The project would systematically record the textile techniques preserved in black farming communities throughout the South, with a particular focus on methods developed during slavery and passed down through generations. The military applications were clear, innovative approaches to textile engineering that had already proven their value in combat equipment, but the historical and cultural significance went far beyond immediate military needs. Harris, recognizing both the practical and historical value of the proposal, approved funding for a 6-month pilot project. Washington would lead a small team, including a technical writer, a photographer, and 2 additional textile specialists, in documenting techniques from his own knowledge and from other experienced individuals in selected communities. This isn't just about parachutes anymore, Washington explained to Rosenthal as they discussed the project. It's about recognizing that valuable knowledge exists in unexpected places, preserved by people whose expertise has been systematically devalued. My grandmother never had the opportunity to attend school, but she understood fabric engineering at a level that surpassed many educated professionals. How many other forms of expertise are we losing because we don't recognize or respect their sources? The documentation project began in January 1945. As the war in Europe moved toward its final phase, Washington's team started with comprehensive recording of his own knowledge, creating detailed diagrams, photographs, and technical descriptions of every technique he had learned from his family. They then expanded their research to include interviews with other experienced textile workers in black communities in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware. The project revealed a rich tradition of textile innovation that had developed in response to necessity. Techniques for reinforcing work clothes, maximizing the lifespan of limited materials, and creating functional items from fabric scraps all demonstrated sophisticated engineering principles, implemented through skilled handwork rather than industrial processes. As the documentation progressed, Washington remained in regular contact with Captain Rosenthal, who continued to provide feedback from the field about the performance of equipment incorporating the Washington techniques. The reinforced parachutes had been used in all subsequent airborne operations, including the drop into the Netherlands for Operation Market Garden and the emergency deployment during the Battle of the Bulge. In each case, the modified designs had outperformed expectations, particularly under adverse conditions. By April 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the pilot documentation project was nearing completion. The resulting materials, hundreds of pages of technical diagrams, photographs, and detailed explanations, represented the most comprehensive recording ever made of textile techniques developed within Black American communities. Colonel Harris, reviewing the preliminary results, was impressed by both the technical detail and the historical significance of the work. "This goes beyond our immediate military applications," he told Washington. "You've documented a previously unrecognized American technical tradition. I believe this material should be preserved in the National Archives after the war." Washington had achieved something remarkable: formal recognition of knowledge that had been developed and preserved despite, and partly because of, centuries of oppression. The techniques that had helped enslaved cotton workers survive an exploitative system had been transformed into innovations that helped American soldiers survive on the battlefield. The full circle of this transformation represented a powerful, if complicated, form of historical redemption. As the war in Europe drew to a close in May 1945, Washington received news that both pleased and humbled him. The Army Quartermaster Corps had decided to officially incorporate what they now called distributed stress textile engineering into their permanent specifications for parachute design and other critical equipment. The technical documentation referred specifically to the Washington method of reinforcement stitching, ensuring that his name would remain attached to the innovation even after the war's end. More personally significant was a letter he received from Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan, who had jumped into Normandy, the Netherlands, and finally into Germany itself, using parachutes incorporating Washington's techniques. "Mr. Washington," Donovan wrote, "as our unit prepares to return home, I wanted to write to you on behalf of many paratroopers whose lives were saved by your parachute designs. Throughout our campaigns, we've exchanged stories about equipment performances, and the modified T-5s consistently performed beyond all expectations. Our battalion commander estimates that at least 28 men in our unit alone survived situations where previous parachute designs would have failed catastrophically. We've heard different versions of your story. Some say you were a textile engineer, others that you were a farmer who understood fabric better than the professionals. Whatever the truth, please know that hundreds of men are coming home to their families because of your contribution to the war effort. You may not have jumped into combat alongside us, but you were with every one of us as we descended into hostile territory. After the war, several of us are planning to meet annually to remember our experiences and honor those who didn't make it back. We would be honored if you would consider attending as our guest. Your work saved many of the men who will be present, and we would welcome the opportunity to thank you in person." The letter included contact information for Donovan, who expected to be discharged and back home in Connecticut by August. For Washington, this invitation represented a form of recognition that transcended official commendations or technical documentation. The men whose lives had been directly affected by his work wanted to acknowledge him personally, to include him in their community of memory. It was a profound validation of his contribution and a bridge across racial divides that had seemed insurmountable just a few years earlier. As the war in the Pacific continued through the summer of 1945, Washington's team expanded their documentation project to include techniques for tropical and maritime environments, anticipating the needs of forces fighting in the Pacific theater. This work was still underway when Japan surrendered in August, bringing the global conflict to an end. The sudden conclusion of the war raised questions about the future of the Technical Advisory Unit and Washington's role within it. Many wartime programs were being rapidly demobilized, and civilian contractors were being released as the military scaled back to peacetime operations. Colonel Harris, however, had been sufficiently impressed by Washington's work to advocate for continuing the documentation project as part of the military's effort to preserve valuable wartime innovations. In September 1945, Harris secured approval for an 18-month extension, with Washington remaining as the project's director. "Your work has proven its value beyond any doubt," Harris told him. "The techniques you've documented will continue saving lives long after this war is over." In October, Washington attended the first reunion of Donovan's paratroop unit, held at a VFW hall in Hartford, Connecticut. The evening was emotional for all involved. Former paratroopers, many still adjusting to civilian life, shared stories of their combat experiences and remembered fallen comrades. Throughout these narratives, the reliability of their parachutes was a recurring theme, equipment that had performed when failure would have meant certain death. When Washington was introduced to the group, the room fell silent for a moment, then erupted in applause. One by one, men came forward to shake his hand, many telling him specific stories about damaged parachutes that had nevertheless delivered them safely to the ground. Former Private Cooper, now working as a mechanic and attending college on the GI Bill, embraced Washington warmly. "I kept my promise," he said that prayer of thanks every time I jumped. "And I prayed for all of you," Washington replied, his voice thick with emotion. As the evening progressed, Washington was struck by the diversity of the men whose lives his work had touched. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from Boston, and immigrant sons from a dozen different backgrounds. They had little in common except their shared experience of combat and their connection to the equipment that had kept them alive. Toward the end of the evening, Donovan, now the elected president of the unit's Veterans Association, presented Washington with a shadow box containing a piece of parachute silk emblazoned with the signatures of over 100 veterans. "This canopy brought me down in Normandy," Donovan explained. "It took shrapnel damage during the descent, but held together exactly as designed. Every man who signed this piece of silk attributes his survival to your innovation. We want you to have it as a token of our gratitude." Washington accepted the gift with tears in his eyes, deeply moved by this tangible connection to the men whose lives had intersected with his work. "My grandmother would be proud," he said simply, "not just of me, but of all of you, of what you accomplished using techniques she taught me." The reunion marked a turning point in Washington's understanding of his contribution to the war effort. What had begun as a technical solution to an engineering problem had become something much more profound, a legacy that connected generations and transcended the racial divisions of American society. The knowledge passed down from his enslaved ancestors had helped preserve the lives of young Americans fighting for freedom on foreign soil, creating a powerful, if unexpected, continuity across American history. In the years following the war, Washington continued his work documenting traditional textile techniques, eventually expanding beyond military applications to create comprehensive records for historical and educational purposes. The wartime innovations he had introduced became standard features in parachute design, not only for military applications, but for civilian and sporting uses as well. The Washington reinforcement method became a standard term in textile engineering, taught in technical schools and universities. The detailed documentation he produced during and after the war was preserved in the National Archives and in the collections of several universities, ensuring that the knowledge developed by generations of black textile workers would be recognized and remembered. In 1948, Washington was invited to speak at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology as part of a symposium on wartime technical innovations. Standing before an audience of engineers and academics, many of whom had initially dismissed the value of traditional knowledge, he spoke about the importance of recognizing expertise in all its forms. "Engineering principles can be discovered and applied in many contexts," he told them. "Sometimes they're expressed in mathematical equations and technical drawings. Sometimes they're expressed in the hands of a grandmother teaching her grandson how to reinforce a cotton sack. Both forms of knowledge are valuable. Both deserve respect and recognition." For the veterans of the airborne divisions, the Isaiah chutes remained a powerful memory, a piece of equipment they had trusted with their lives. At their annual reunions, Washington was always an honored guest, a living connection to the innovation that had saved so many of their comrades. During one such reunion in 1952, Cooper, by then an engineering student himself, approached Washington with a question that had long been on his mind. "I've been studying textile engineering," he said, "and I've learned all the technical explanations for why your reinforcement patterns work so effectively. But I'm curious, how did you explain it to yourself before all the engineers got involved? How did your grandmother explain it to you?" Washington considered the question thoughtfully. "My grandmother used to say that fabric is like water," he replied. "It wants to flow along certain paths. If you try to block it completely, it builds up pressure until it breaks through, often catastrophically. But if you create channels for it to flow through, if you work with its natural tendencies rather than against them, it will carry tremendous loads without breaking." The engineers came along later and called it distributed stress dynamics and calculated the exact mathematical relationships. But my grandmother understood the principle perfectly well without the fancy terminology. She understood it in her hands and in her eyes, from years of working with the material. Cooper nodded slowly. "That makes perfect sense to me," he said, "and it probably would have made more sense to those engineers at Fort Benning than all their calculations, if they'd been willing to listen from the beginning." For Washington, this conversation represented the fulfillment of his grandmother's legacy. The knowledge she had preserved and passed down had not only saved lives, but had entered the formal canon of engineering understanding. Her wisdom, born from necessity and oppression, had been transformed into innovation that was now recognized and valued by the very institutions that had once dismissed it. As he looked around the room at the veterans whose lives had been touched by his work, Washington felt a profound sense of connection to his ancestors who had developed these techniques under the harshest conditions imaginable, to his grandmother who had preserved and passed them on despite all obstacles, and to these young men who had entrusted their lives to fabric, reinforced with patterns developed generations earlier in the cotton fields of the American South. It was a connection that spanned the contradictions and complexities of American history, a thread of knowledge and innovation that had survived through hardship and found new purpose in a moment of global crisis. The 500 lives saved during the Normandy drop represented just the beginning of a legacy that would continue to unfold in ways none of them could have predicted. In the textile engineering labs at universities across the country, in the design specifications for modern parachute systems, and in the collective memory of the airborne veterans and their families, the story of Isaiah Washington and his grandmother's stitching patterns endured, a testament to the value of knowledge, preserved against all odds, and to the unexpected paths that innovation can take when expertise is recognized regardless of its source. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.